For the French president, it was a mission to mend fractured ties with Algiers. But did his trip reinforce the relationship between the two governments or highlight its weaknesses? I'm Jafar Hassan, and today's newsmaker is Emmanuel Macron's trip to Algeria. This very might well be a case where an apology would have been worth 1,000 words. But on Emmanuel Macron's trip to Algeria last week, he resisted, despite such a demand being made by so many who continue to be scarred by nearly a century and a half of colonialism. Instead, Emmanuel Macron urged his counterparts to turn the page, even open the history books, literally, in a bid to dig through their tortured pasts and make amends. Both sides know there is money to be made in a euros for natural gas kind of transaction. But whether or not diplomacy and finance can overcome such a fractious relationship is yet to be seen. Here is Ahad Al-Fadli with more.
France and Algeria have agreed to open a new page in relations, one that celebrates the North African nation's 60 years of independence, while also observing the dark legacy of its French colonial rulers.
We have a complex, painful common past, and it has at times prevented us from looking to the future.
France's need to improve ties with its former colony are at an all-time high. European powers are scrambling to replace Russian gas supplies, and for Algeria, Africa's largest gas exporter, this is an opportunity for it to expand its influence and make a lot of money.
I have discussed with President Macron all the aspects of bilateral cooperation and the means to boost it as serving common interests for our countries and ensures giving a strong boost to our ties in all fields to strengthen the new direction that we agreed on, to build an exceptional and inclusive partnership with the principles of mutual respect, trust, and power balance between the two countries.
But the relationship between the two countries are marred by more than 130 years of French colonial rule, and ended with a bloody war that lasted for 8 years. The number of dead is a sticking point in the history books. France says 27,000 of its troops died, along with another 5,000 civilians. But while it puts Algerian losses at 500,000, Algerians put it somewhere at 1.5 million. That troubled history turned into a diplomatic row last year. Macron reportedly questioned whether Algeria had even existed as a nation before French colonialism. He accused Algeria's leaders of rewriting history, one where independence is based on hatred of France. Algeria responded by withdrawing its ambassador to France and closed its airspace to French aircrafts. And then there are the public schools. In a further step away from its colonial past, next month they'll begin teaching English instead of French. Algerian President Abdelmajid Tebboune explained the move by calling the French language a spoil of war. The anti-French sentiment might be why Macron was briefly heckled on his trip, as protesters chanted, "1, 2, 3, long live Algeria." However, Macron did strike up one deal with his Algerian counterparts, and it focuses on this fractured history that's caused so much tension.
We have already decided that we will mandate a joint committee with historians to open up our archives and allow them to look back at this decisive history for us, from the start of the colonization to the war for Algerian independence, with no taboo, with the will of free work, with complete access to our archives.
But while this overture is meant to mend relations between the two sides, one has to ask what kind of friendship comes at a cost of natural gas. Ahad Fadli, The Newsmakers.
All right, let's bring in our panel. Joining me now from Saint Malo, France, is Jacques Reland, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. From Paris is human rights and civil liberties activist Yasser Louati. And from the Greek island of Samos is political analyst Klaus Jurgens. Thanks all for being with us here today on The Newsmakers. Jacques, let me begin with you. What would it take for France to apologize for crimes it committed when it colonized Algeria?
What would it take to take... Sorry, I did not expect that type of question immediately. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, yeah, actually, France has decided after this visit, during this visit, there was an agreement that there would be a joint commission of French and Algerian historians looking at the evil committed by the French during the colonization period from 1830 to 1962. Until now, there had been one commission who produced a report headed by Benjamin Stora, a French historian, which looked at the French crimes committed during the War of Independence between 1954 and 1962. This time, they decided to broaden the scope to look at all the evils of colonization, and it was needed after the blunder committed by Macron about a year ago when he said that Algeria did not exist until French colonization, and which was a historical mistake, and did not apologize for the evils of colonization during that time. Even though he had said previously in 2016, I think it was, or 2017, just before he was elected president, during the campaign, that he agreed that colonization was a crime against humanity. Since then, he has not reiterated this word, but has made some gestures, more than any other president in France, to recognize the evils of colonization and the evils committed by the French army and the French settlers during the Independence War.
Okay, let me add one more question here. Do you think it's likely for the French president to apologize for it at any time in the future, or that's never going to happen?
There's a policy line on Macron and French presidents is not to apologize, to recognize a mistake, but not apologize. Because also, you know, the Algerian history, the Franco-Algerian history, goes back a long way and affects an awful lot of people in France. I think about 10 million people have a link with Algeria.
Okay, Yasser, now, Macron acknowledges the mistakes, but he won't apologize. That sounds mind-boggling, doesn't it?
Well, it is quite, I mean, we have to understand that, and I do agree with what has been said right before me, that to apologize will take tremendous efforts, if it not to be exceptional at all. But it did happen. Chirac, in the 1990s, apologized to the French Jews for France's betrayal of its citizens and its role with Nazi Germany. And the same thing happened with Emmanuel Macron towards them as well. But we should not, discount the influence of the former settlers, the so-called Pieds Noirs, who have been, since they are leaving Algeria, lobbying the French government in order not to apologize and furthermore to uphold the colonial legacy. Now, what is problematic with Emmanuel Macron, he did say that colonization was indeed a crime against humanity, but as usual, the so-called en même temps, at the same time, he says something one day and he backtracks the next day after calling colonization a crime against humanity.
Why do you think he does? Why do you think he is doing that? Is he scared of the far right? Is that what it is?
Well, Emmanuel Macron does not have a true political backbone. I mean, he's not a person who made muscles through a long career in politics. He came to the national headlines, back in 2015-16. That's it. So, in order for him to resist pressure from lobbies, it would take for him to, pardon my language, to man up a little bit and to show courage while saying, yes, France did participate in the massacres of hundreds of thousands of Algerians. Yes, France is responsible, and let's move forward from now on and build the so-called, a common future. But Emmanuel Macron does not have that. And that's why we see contradiction between his visit today, his cozying up to the Algerian regime, while a few months ago, he called out this very regime and even said that they were turning colonization and memory into a business.
All right, now, Klaus, let me come to you. According to experts, coming to terms with the awful crimes against humanity that were committed in Algeria is a painful process. I think no one is going to deny that. But do you think France as a country is ready right now to go through this process?
Well, thanks for being back. Now, you may know, or maybe I never mentioned that my family, after the Second World War, father's side, moved to Paris. So I'm extremely, is the wrong word, but very, very well versed with the French politics for many decades, growing up, going to university and what have you. Now, I think France has to come to terms with it, that the world has changed, a new geopolitical order. And France always was one of the big five. We are talking about United Nations reform at the moment. But the global standing of France somehow diminished over the years, over the decades. Now we have Emmanuel Macron, who somehow has, in a post-pandemic world, the task to re-establish France as a real global player. One visit to Algeria, of course, doesn't change that. But I think it is a positive step. You have to take the rough with the smooth. Now, I expected an apology, to be honest, like my esteemed colleague. I think only saying young people have to work together and now there's a new phase of cooperation and everything is fine. This is falling short of my expectations. 60 years after independence, I think Paris should simply say we made mistakes, we owe and live up to them, and it's a new world order, and let's cooperate. And if there is a second question coming up, I want to talk about the gas dimension, the top 10, of course, with Algeria in the producers market, because I have a slight doubt about could that have been a 10% reasoning for going. But in general, of course, as a French politician, president, you have to go 60 years of independence. You have to make sure that the people in Algeria understand France has changed. With all my due modesty, has it?
Okay, good points there. Jacques, let me pick up on one thing that Klaus mentioned about the way geopolitics, the world, the system of geopolitics has changed. And perhaps one of the reasons why France is struggling right now when it comes to issuing an apology to Algeria is because, as Klaus says, France has in some ways failed in acknowledging this change. Would you agree?
No, I would not say that France has failed to acknowledge the change in the global context of geopolitics. And actually, the geopolitical dimension was present in that visit, even though it was low-key, but it was deep. Because, for example, for France, where it's been a key player, is in West Africa and the Sahel, okay? And there, they have to act in partnership with Algeria. They've known that for a long time. So Algeria has a common border with Mali, which is about 1,400 kilometers, I believe. And therefore, the cooperation with Algeria in order to sort out the issue of terrorism and growing jihadism in the Sahel region, moving even further down towards the Gulf of Guinea, is a big concern for the French, but I think it is also a big concern for Algeria, which has known.
But if I may, is it really the problems that you mentioned, or perhaps the fact that France needs gas from Algeria?
No. That's France. France has nuclear power. Macron said it himself that gas supplies only account for 9% of our energy, and Algiers is a supplier, but not much. Actually, Algeria is very limited in their export capacities due to infrastructural problems. It needs some investment. And I suppose that as part of the visit, actually, there was an agreement for the French and the Algerian to cooperate on improving the oil infrastructure, the gas infrastructure in Algeria. But the biggest client of Algeria is Italy. Italy relies a lot on Algerian gas, and actually Macron said, yeah, they talked about it. He said it was not the aim of the visit.
If I may, Jacques, very quickly. So, as I understand, you were saying France does not need Algeria when it comes to gas supply, correct?
Not that much. It's only a small supply. Yeah.
Okay, let me put this to Yasser. Yasser, would you agree?
It will be, of course, France prides itself in having, in being a major supplier or a major producer of nuclear power. 67% of our electricity in France is produced thanks to nuclear plants. But there are two problems already. First, the price of electricity in the European market is pegged to fossil fuel, which makes France dependent, and French consumers the victims of skyrocketing prices. I mean, like the megawatt cost went from 85 euros to 1,000 euros in just a few days. But the other problem, and this is what has been mentioned about Italy, France is actually trying to compete with Italy in obtaining Algerian gas, and we saw other visits and other so-called agreements with Qatar and the UAE in order to offset the losses due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, the ending of Russian gas, supplying in Europe. We also have another problem. Climate change has forced, the national provider of electricity to shut down nuclear plants because of the heat and the drought affecting rivers which are needed to cool down reactors. So we are not in a situation where France can say we don't need Algerian gas because we have other providers or we have other means of energy production. France is desperate for gas because at the first, locally in France, we know Macron is facing a hostile environment, politically speaking, with the left organizing to confront him in the coming months. So, we have the risk of a dissolution of the National Assembly. Okay. And Emmanuel Macron does not want to further anger the French public with the high energy prices.
Okay, Jacques, let me come back to you now. Certainly, many would argue that the influence of France in Algeria is declining. For example, not long ago, we heard from official sources in Algeria that they want to change the language, the medium of language in primary schools from French to English. Certainly, that did not go well with the French president, did it?
No, certainly not. But actually, what the French were more worried about is actually the phenomenon of Arabization, i.e. Removing French language from the curriculum at primary level and encouraging the speaking of Arabic in Algeria. And it's true that among the young people or students, more and more today want to learn English because they think it's more useful in the world than French. With English, you can deal with the whole world. With French, you have a more limited field of activity. It is one of the issues. And actually, there was a great hostility toward the French language. One thing which was noticed in this trip, where President Abdelmajid Tebboune was very complimentary towards Macron, is also the fact that he spoke in French, which I think he never does. He actually, when he intervened in front of the press, Macron, he spoke French, which was seen as a gesture of goodwill, as well as the send-off, where he accompanied him to the airport. The plane was surrounded by fighter jets all the way until the limit of the Algerian airspace. So actually, it was a successful visit. Let's not forget that there's been really bad blood between the French, especially since the declarations last year relating to the military power and the fact colonization that Algeria was a nation. But this visit was meant, that was the aim. It had nothing to do with the main aim was to repair the damage caused by last year's feud, which led to the recalling of the Algerian ambassador.
Okay, Jacques.
And stopping the
okay, so Jacques, so you're saying that this was a good visit. Let me put this to Klaus. Now, Klaus, if this was a successful visit, as Jacques says it was, then why did we see protesters out on the streets?
Well, there's always, you have to take the rough with the smooth, as the English say. Of course, from the French perspective, it was a success. Talking about young people coming back together and uniting, and the past is the past, and we lay a new foundation. But at the same time, you must understand the sentiment in Algeria as well. It can't happen overnight. It takes a little bit more time. So I agree with my esteemed colleagues. It is a step into the right direction, and it is wonderful to see with family background and everything. But now, I want to put it, if I may, half a minute into the wider perspective. France, of course, is not doing it like a fair weather policy, and only because it's 60 years of independence. Every politician, every government has a wider agenda, a wider picture. Now, the wider picture, of course, and this is what my dear colleague just said, yes, there will be elections coming up in some time. Emmanuel Macron must position himself as a strong leader against Le Pen. He must at the same time say, we do value democracy everywhere. Where I grew up, we had an Algerian family, Moroccan family, basically every door. It was wonderful. But the integration happened only decades later. Now, I am disappointed that there was no apology, but I'm looking forward. I think it is a step into the right direction, as my colleague said.
Okay, Yasser, I saw you shake your head a few moments ago. Would you like to respond to Klaus?
Well, I think Klaus, is definitely right in his analysis. However, we have to acknowledge that, cozying up to the Algerian regime does not mean cozying up or making a faithful step toward the Algerian people. We have to remember the mass demonstrations of the past 2-3 years in Algeria against this very Algerian regime. At the same time, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for Emmanuel Macron to stand tall against the far right, given that he ran on a far right platform during his election. He made sure Marine Le Pen would accede to the second round. He passed the anti-separatism law, which is specifically targeting Muslims and widely civil society with the comprehensive security bill. And on top of it, we have to remember the debate he had with Marine Le Pen, during which he failed to call her for what she is, the leader of a neo-fascist movement set up by people who had collaborated with the Nazis. Now, this is where the en même temps, if Emmanuel Macron hits a wall again, he makes one step in one direction and 3 others in a different one. And yes, the local context is extremely volatile for Emmanuel Macron, and for him to change foreign policy, I mean, we have seen him for the past few years. France's foreign policy is a complete mess and is unreadable. One day he does something, the next day he does something else. So how long will it take for Emmanuel Macron to pose a long-term foreign policy? To be honest, I do not know, especially now with the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Just one more point, please. The reshuffling and the overhauling of the diplomatic corps, which will make it even more difficult to have a stable, readable, and long-term foreign policy under Emmanuel Macron.
Okay, Jacques, I know you want to respond. Please jump in.
Actually, yes, there was a lot. I mean, I think it's a bit caricatural in that part. I want to go back to the Algeria issue. One thing which was not reported as much is the fact that for the first time since 1962, the top brass, military, security forces, and intelligence services gathered in a meeting with President Macron and President Emmanuel. So it's for the first time there's a realization that they work together. But the scope for good cooperation is limited by the fact that Algeria hasn't got always the same interest as France, and there are conflicts between. It will not be easy. There's a step, but for example, there's a very conservative French in the high echelons of the French Algerian government, which doesn't want to reconcile at all with French. There are some clashes over the issue. Morocco, France has to deal with Algeria and Morocco are in conflict over Western Sahara. And there's the elephant in the room is Russia's presence and influence in the region, which is feared by France and actually not feared as much by Algeria. Algiers is Algeria is on good terms with Russia. Algeria will have actually military maneuvers with Russian forces very soon. So it's Algeria has to play with different partners. France also has to play with them. But there's one thing about France's foreign policy. There's one thing which is very clear about it. It's Europe first, Europe, and the European future security depends on a calmer situation in Africa. Africa is ultimately the very important thing, and Algeria is a key player in that because the African-European relationship will be crucial for the coming years.
Okay, Jacques, Klaus, Yasser, thanks very much for talking to us here on The Newsmakers today, and thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.